When I finally take my product that I'm happy with into Maya, I have a play around with it, and first of all I make sure that the point of origin is in the center of the scene. Then, referring to some videos on YouTube, this one in particular by Flipped Normals, on how UVing works in the basics of a human head, I create some UVs for my character, and I make the cuts in my model where I want them to be. After some experimentation with the cuts, I realise I need to make the shoulders one separate UV shell, and this enables me to get the UVs how I want them, and spread them out across the texture sheet that I've got. Then I do a series of optimizations to the UVs and arrangements and layouts so that they look like how they do here in Substance Painter after I've took them into Substance Painter. As this was the first time I was taking the UVs and putting them in Substance Painter, I was just having a bit of an experiment with them. So I actually went back, and because I missed recording some of the parts of the UVing process, I went back to square one and started the UV again by this time importing both the eyes and the face in a low poly and high poly version in order to get two separate meshes exported. Within Maya, I make the spheres of the eyes into actual spheres rather than Dynamesh spheres that I used in ZBrush. This way I can UV them a lot easier with a spherical UV algorithm that Maya provides, rather than having to UV them with a really weird topology due to Dynamesh. So again, I make the cuts where I want them, and I get my UV shells, and I optimize them, I orient them, I put them where I want them. Well, the layout tool does put them neatly into this scene, but by optimizing them and making the cuts in the right places, I'm able to get a UV mapping for my whole low poly mesh. It's important to note that I did scale my mesh up to the size of an example scale man that we had received supplied to us, and this way if I was to import it into, say, Unreal Engine, it would be the correct size for use in a game or on a character. When I go to paint some of my mesh, I actually realise that when I paint the eyes, it paints the eye sockets around them, which isn't the effect that I wanted. So I have to go back into Maya, and I make sure that they're separate objects, but I export them as a grouped set of objects, as an FBX, and this way I'm able to have separate texture sets when I take it into Substance Painter, which really helps to make it work. also that I made sure to put the high poly mesh at the same location as the low poly mesh, for when I take it into Substance to experiment, I bake the high poly detail onto the low poly mesh because they're contained within the same space in Maya, both at the 0, 0 coordinates with the same origin point. This here is where I'm actually assigning materials in Maya to make sure that the texture sets work in Substance, as I mentioned earlier. As you can see, when I take it back into Substance, it now has separate texture sets named eyes underscore material and face underscore material, and this means that I can paint them separately, and yeah, it works this way rather than having them on one UV map. It caused some errors before. Following some tutorials from Substance Painter's website, I'm able to mess around, make some dirt maps, and add some detail and effect to my Substance Painter painting, and use fill layers to mask certain detail onto the shape. So I start to change the skin color to make it look like the reference skin color, and I start adding in some highlights with the brush tool, and also adding in the pink sort of skin color that you get above the forehead and on the nose and the ears. Well, I'll do the ears later, but also the yellow under the eyes, and just getting the right colors on the skin where I want them, so that it looks more like my reference. I particularly do this sometimes by using the color dropper on my reference image for the correct base color at least, and then I go in and I use a low opacity brush and kind of paint over the existing color, and then I again use the color dropper once I've combined two of the colors with low opacity and paint over it again and again until there's a clean blend that looks less like brush strokes on the face. I do start to work on the ears, and I first paint one of them very pink, and I realised I wasn't in symmetrical mode, so I have to go again and paint the other one slightly pink, but it can be more realistic because there's variance in either side, but I did want to paint with symmetry, however it didn't turn out like that. To paint the lips, I use a bit of a stronger opacity brush and just get the colour of pink on the lips and keep it separate from the rest of the skin. I then go on to the eyes, and to do the eyes I take a brush of brown, put it in, take some black, put that in, and once it's the right shape it kind of gives me the right look for the eyes. I realised that I want the eyes to be more reflective than the rest of the model, so I go in and I make a separate layer for painting with, and I set my brush to have no colour properties, but I only give it a low roughness value and some metallic properties, and I just paint the low roughness and the metallic properties onto the eye, and it means that it can then reflect the light sources that are in the scene after the render, which, as in my reference, you can clearly see that it's reflecting the light from the camera. Before rendering it out, I noticed some weird visual glitches on the side of the cheek, so I make sure that is fixed up by painting normals over it and just fixing the normals in general, which I then am able to upload it to Sketchfab as my render. And I then noticed that I had left some of the glitchy visual effects on the other side of the face because symmetry wasn't on. So this draft render showed me how that turned out, and I also noticed perhaps the eyes are a bit too glossy, so I lower that after I go back and assess my first render. I refine the texture and shading in my Substance Painter file, so the texture doesn't have those normal glitches on them anymore, and it works a bit better. I do a re-upload of my model and make sure it looks right, and then after that I look at it in full screen and get the full finalized render for it, and here it is.